They told her the sack held what she'd paid for: a man willing to marry, start a farm, and never ask questions. That was the agreement when Luella rode 4 days to reach the prairie auction, clutching every last coin her late father had hidden beneath the floorboards. She stood among ranchers and dusty-eyed traders, the only woman in the crowd bidding for a future no one believed she deserved. "Lot 17, the caller had barked, and the burlap sack was dropped unceremoniously at her feet, tied tight at the top like something dangerous. But it moved. Just slightly, just enough to make her stomach turn. No one else reacted. No one else noticed. They just laughed at the woman with the twisted ankle and the hopeful eyes, limping forward to claim her prize. Luella reached down, hands trembling, and pulled the rope loose. The fabric sagged, and then she gasped. Nestled in the folds was not a man, not even a note. It was a baby, swaddled in an old shirt, cheeks flushed from heat, eyes closed in sleep. A girl, no more than a few weeks old, with a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her temple. The crowd erupted in hoots. "Guess she overpaid," someone cackled. Another voice called, "Maybe it'll cry less than a husband would." Luella couldn't breathe. She looked up, around, searching the faces, the seller, the hands that passed the sack. But they had already moved on to Lot 18. No one claimed a mistake. No one looked guilty. And no one stopped her as she stood there, cradling the child that someone had sold like livestock. Her heart was pounding so loud she couldn't hear the wind. The baby stirred, yawned, and pressed its tiny face against her chest like it already knew her. Luella had come for a man who'd work beside her. What she got was someone who couldn't even stand. But her arms didn't let go. Not even when the auctioneer gave her a pitying shrug and turned away. Not even when the sun beat down hotter and her leg throbbed. She turned toward the road, sack swinging empty at her side, baby tucked against her shoulder. And she whispered the first words she hadn't said aloud in months. "It's okay. I'll figure it out." And the baby, like it understood, let out a sigh and fell asleep again, like home was already here. By the time Luella made it back to the small one-room cabin she'd borrowed from a kind widow outside town, her arms ached, and the baby had started to whimper from hunger. She laid the child gently on a folded quilt, then reached into the burlap sack again, hoping for anything. Milk, cloth, a name. Her fingers scraped something thin at the bottom. A piece of paper, folded tight and stained with sweat. She unfolded it slowly, half afraid it would vanish like smoke. The writing was rough, scrawled in charcoal pencil. "Her name is Mercy. I couldn't do it. If you found her, please give her a chance." That was all. No signature, no explanation, just that name, Mercy, and a plea from someone who had walked away. Luella stared at the baby, who was now blinking up at her, eyes dark and uncertain. "Mercy," she whispered, tasting the word. It felt too holy for what had just happened, too gentle for the violence of being passed off in a sack. But the baby didn't seem bothered. She grabbed Luella's finger with a surprising strength and held on. Luella sat back against the wall, the floor creaking under her, the weight of her entire life shifting with every quiet breath that rose from the blanket. She had been planning to plant corn, fix the roof, and maybe, just maybe, build something that didn't fall apart. A man was supposed to help her do that, not a baby, not this. But her body didn't ask permission before it leaned forward, before she tucked the note into her apron and wrapped Mercy tighter in the quilt. She didn't need to think about what came next. She only needed to keep the baby warm, keep her fed, keep her safe, at least for tonight. And yet, questions buzzed in her ears like flies. Who had done this? Why a public auction? Who had decided mercy was worth the price of silence? The town wouldn't care. They'd seen her limp. They'd seen her spend her last coins. To them, this would just be another strange chapter in the life of a woman who couldn't find a husband. But Luella knew something had changed. Not just in her plans, but in her heart. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. And the sound of Mercy's soft, sleepy breathing filled the cabin like the promise of something bigger than both of them. Morning hadn't fully broken when Luella heard the knock. A slow, deliberate rhythm that made her freeze mid-step. Mercy was still asleep in the crook of her arm, her tiny fingers curled around the frayed edge of Luella's shawl. No one ever came this early, and certainly not to this cabin, which sat nearly forgotten at the end of a winding, rutted trail. She tucked the baby closer and stepped barefoot toward the door, her heart pounding. When she opened it, a man stood there, tall, rough-jacketed, with dirt on his boots and something unreadable in his eyes. He didn't remove his hat. He didn't smile. He just looked at Luella, then down at the bundle in her arms. "That sack," he said, voice gravel-thick. "Did you open it?" Luella didn't answer. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. His eyes had already settled on Mercy, and his jaw clenched. "I was told she'd be taken far from here, that no one would know." He sounded less like he was asking and more like he was begging her to lie. "And who told you that?" Luella asked, keeping the door between them. "Her mother?" The man shifted, then finally took off his hat and pressed it to his chest. "Number her father. Me." Luella blinked. The man didn't look like someone who gave babies away in sacks. He looked like someone who wrestled cattle and didn't flinch at blood. And yet here he was, on her porch, eyes shining like glass under pressure. "They said she wouldn't live, that she'd been cursed, born during the storm when the lightning split the steeple. My wife, she believed them, but I didn't. I just couldn't keep her." He wasn't asking for her back. That much was clear. Luella had seen too many men try to undo their own cowardice by claiming things they never fought for. But this man wasn't reaching. He was mourning. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here?" He shook his head. "Because I heard what you did at the auction. Heard how you paid more than anyone had ever paid for. Anything like that. And I thought, maybe you were someone who didn't believe in curses." Luella didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at Mercy, who was starting to stir, lips twitching toward hunger. Then she looked up at the man and said only, "She's fed. She's warm. That's more than she had yesterday." He nodded slowly, stepping back. "I won't come again." And then he turned and walked down the path, vanishing into the low mist curling between the trees, leaving Luella with the child he couldn't claim, but couldn't leave alone either. 2 days passed without another knock. Luella had settled into a rhythm, feeding Mercy when she cried, rocking her by the hearth when the wind picked up, whispering lullabies she barely remembered learning. But something shifted on the 3rd morning when she found a folded piece of paper wedged beneath her door. It wasn't sealed, just creased once and weighed down with a small, flat stone. There was no name on it, but the handwriting was steady and careful, the kind made by someone not used to writing but trying hard to get it right. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," it began, "and I ain't got the right to thank you either. But if that girl's still breathing, still warm, it's because you did what I couldn't." Luella read it twice, her fingers trembling just slightly. Mercy lay against her shoulder, cooing softly, completely unaware that a ghost was speaking through ink and paper. The letter continued. "My wife's gone now. She blamed the child till the end. Said no woman should have screamed like that, not during the storm. But it wasn't the storm that cursed her. It was us. Too blind and too proud to hold a baby that came crying into the world same as any other. I buried her last spring, alone. And I kept thinking about that sack. What was inside it? What I'd done. Luella sat at the table, the paper growing damp in her hands. She wanted to feel angry, to curse the man who had left an infant to fate. But all she could feel was the ache of what he didn't say, the shame stitched between each line. If she ever asks, the letter ended, don't tell her I was cruel, tell her I was weak. And if there's anything left in me worth forgiveness, it's in that sack you opened. That baby, she's more than I ever was. Luella folded the paper again, smoothing it with her palm, then tucked it into a worn tin where she kept old seeds and spare buttons. She wouldn't show it to Mercy. Not now. Maybe not ever. But part of her was glad the man had written. Not for her sake, but because sometimes the only penance left was truth, laid bare in silence. Outside, the wind caught in the trees like breath through lungs. Luella looked down at Mercy's round face and whispered, "You are not cursed. You are chosen." And in the stillness of that moment, the cabin felt like a place reborn. Not just shelter, but a beginning neither of them had planned for, and both of them needed. Luella was washing clothes by the creek when she heard it. A cough, short and sharp, followed by the unmistakable rustle of feet on dried pine needles. She looked up and saw a man standing at the edge of the clearing, barefoot, his clothes threadbare, his eyes sunken from travel. He held no weapon, no sack, nothing but a slouching hat in one hand and something like shame in the other. Luella's breath tightened. She reached back instinctively, hand grazing the hem of Mercy's blanket where the baby lay nestled in a basket by the rock. But the man didn't move forward. He just stood there, letting the silence stretch between them like a rope pulled taut. "I ain't here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I think I know who she is." Luella narrowed her eyes, scanning his face. There was a flicker of resemblance, around the mouth, the brows. "You wrote the letter," she said, though he hadn't introduced himself. He nodded once. "Didn't think I'd ever come. But when the thaw hit and the roads opened, I couldn't sit with it anymore." Luella stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "She doesn't know you," she said, voice steady. "She knows warm milk and morning songs. She knows this patch of sky above her cradle. That's enough." The man's jaw twitched. "It should be." He took a hesitant step forward, then stopped. I didn't come to take her. I came to see if she looked okay, that's all. To know she's real. That she lived." Luella studied him, the wear in his shoulders, the absence of boots on his feet. He wasn't a man come to claim. He was a man come to confess without asking for a second chance. "She's real," Luella said softly. "And she laughs when I whistle. She curls her hand around my thumb. That's all you need to know." The man nodded again, blinking too fast. "Then I'll be going." He turned, but Luella stopped him. "She needs a middle name," she said. "Haven't decided yet." He paused, shoulders frozen, then said without turning, "Call her Mercy June." That was the month she came. Luella didn't answer. He disappeared into the trees like he'd never been there, just a shadow moving through the woods. But the air felt different when he left, lighter somehow. She turned back to the creek, lifted Mercy into her arms, and whispered, "Mercy June, I think you just met the part of your story we'll tell slowly, when you're ready to ask." It started with the flour sack. Luella had gone into town for the first time in weeks. Mercy swaddled close to her chest, hoping to trade eggs for a pound of flour and maybe some sewing needles. But the moment she stepped inside the general store, the room quieted like someone had drawn a curtain over every mouth. Behind the counter, Mrs. Kelton narrowed her eyes. "You're the one with the baby," she said flatly. "The auction bride." A man near the barrels muttered, "Paid full price and got a screaming sack." Another laughed. Luella stiffened but didn't flinch. "And worth every penny," she said coolly, placing the egg crate on the counter with steady hands. Mercy stirred against her chest, letting out a soft hiccup. The storekeeper's wife, a younger woman with kind eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "Is she all right?" she asked, ignoring the glares around her. Luella nodded. "More than all right. She eats like a ranch hand and dreams like a saint." The younger woman smiled faintly, but Mrs. Kelton snorted. "Just don't go asking for sympathy when she grows up with no father and no name. We don't want our girls thinking that's how life begins." Luella didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink. "Names come later. Dignity comes first." And then, carefully, she unswaddled Mercy just enough to show the infant's face, rosy-cheeked, sleeping, one tiny fist curled against Luella's collarbone like a promise. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the man by the barrels scoffed. "Looks like trouble waiting to happen." Luella turned to him. "Then I guess you know what trouble looks like." She didn't wait for change. She took her flower, tucked Mercy back close, and walked out into the sun as the door slammed behind her. But later that evening, someone knocked on her cabin door. It was the younger storekeeper's wife. She carried a small bag of dried apples and a folded blanket. "I had one once," she said quietly. "Lost her before the first snow. If you ever need anything, I'm just past the creek bend." Luella didn't say much, just nodded, accepted the gift, and invited her in for tea. Mercy slept through it all, unaware that in a town full of stares and scoffs, one pair of hands had started reaching instead of pointing. And in Luella's chest, something unclenched. Maybe not trust, but the first step toward it. Because maybe the world wouldn't change for Mercy, but Luella would change the world around her. One whisper at a time. The letter came wrapped in oilskin, marked with the seal of Fort Timberhold, carried by a boy on horseback who didn't wait for a reply. Luella stared at it for a long time before opening it, fingers trembling not with fear, but the cold realization that something from the past had finally caught up. Inside was a brief, formal note. To the woman in possession of the child left at Carson Ridge auction, be advised that the Army is seeking to confirm custody status regarding one Mercy Ann. There are questions about her origin and safety. No signature, no explanation. Just questions. Loaded, bureaucratic questions that smelled of someone powerful waking up late. Luella's mind reeled. Had someone reported her? The general store? The preacher's wife? Or was it the man who'd sold her the sack? The one with no eyes for anything but coin? She clutched Mercy tighter, who looked up at her with perfect trust, gumming a corner of the worn baby quilt. The next morning, Luella rode straight to Fort Timberhold. Not with anger, not even fear, with fire in her bones. She didn't dress to impress, just her cleanest shawl and boots mended with care. When the guard at the gate frowned, she said, "I'm here about a child you abandoned." The officer behind the desk tried to wave her off, citing forms and names, but she pulled Mercy into the light and said, "This child cried so hard that day her voice broke. Ask your records if they mention that." He didn't. He just stared. Then a captain arrived, a wiry man with a limp and sharp eyes, and studied Mercy like he'd seen her before. "We thought the infant had died," he muttered, "after the mother passed in quarantine. No one claimed her." Luella looked him dead in the eye. "She's been claimed. Federal. Rocked to sleep. Burped after beans. She's mine, whether your ink says so or not." The captain looked at Mercy again. The child sneezed. He blinked. "No one's contesting," he finally said. "We just needed to know where she landed." Luella didn't thank him. She didn't need to. She stood, adjusted her sling, and walked out with the same grace she'd walked into that store with, weeks ago. But when she got home, something new awaited. An envelope on her porch, unsealed. Inside was no name, just a folded paper with a single line. She wasn't the first, and beneath that a drawing, childlike, rough, done in charcoal, a baby's face, with the same eyes as Mercy. Luella sat down, slowly, porch creaking beneath her. The world had just opened again, wide and wild and full of ghosts that maybe weren't dead after all. It was near dusk when she saw him, leaning against the post outside the trading station, eyes fixed on Mercy, like the world had stopped spinning for him. Luella didn't recognize the man, but something in her chest shifted the moment she did. He was young, early 20s maybe, tall and lean with the same soft, fierce gaze Mercy gave the stars each night. His boots were muddy but polished, his coat worn but mended. Someone who'd run long and fast, and hadn't yet stopped running inside. She tightened her grip on Mercy, who cooed softly and reached in the man's direction. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, unsure. "Her name's Mercy?" Luella gave no answer, just stepped between them like instinct. He didn't flinch. I think she's my sister." That made her laugh once, bitter and sharp. "Nice try," she said. "You want coin, you can keep walking." But he didn't. He pulled a faded charcoal sketch from his coat. Same as the one in the envelope. But this one was older, folded 100 times. "My mama drew this. She died at Red Hill Quarantine Station. She was pregnant when we fled Georgia. I thought the baby died too. They told me she never made it past the fever." Luella didn't want to believe him. Couldn't. Because if this was true, it meant Mercy had a name that wasn't hers, a bloodline she didn't know, and that Luella's claim, every rock, every midnight walk, every lullaby, wasn't enough. But Mercy reached for him again, touched the sketch like it was familiar, then looked at Luella as if to ask, "Is it okay?" And that broke her. She sat down right there on the porch step, all the breath gone. "What was your mama's name?" she whispered. "Eden," he said. "Eden Fairlow." Luella closed her eyes. "The man who handed me that sack never looked at me, just said, 'She's what's left.' And I thought he meant a wife, a woman, not a child." The man, Jonas, nodded slow, as if pieces were finally fitting after years of living with jagged edges. He didn't reach for Mercy, didn't demand or assume. He just sat too on the bottom step, letting the silence hold them all. "She looks safe," he said. Luella looked down at Mercy's face, round and drowsy against her chest. "She is." And then, because the moment demanded it, she whispered, "But she doesn't know you. You'll have to earn her." Jonas nodded once. "I wouldn't want it any other way." And there they sat. Blood and bond, history and accident, 3 strangers on a porch where everything had been taken once. And maybe now, something could begin. The next morning came with an envelope, slid beneath her door. Luella opened it with stiff fingers, expecting maybe a thank you, maybe some story wrapped in grief. But it was a deed, signed, sealed, and notarized, with her name on it. The cottage, the half-acre it sat on, and a modest stipend drawn from a trust bearing the Fairlow name. Jonas had left it with the clerk before dawn, with a note that read, "For the woman who saved my sister, and gave her more than I ever could." Luella sat on the floor, Mercy tucked against her, staring at the paper like it might vanish if she blinked. It was too much, too permanent, too kind. She stepped out into the cool morning, hoping to find him, maybe talk sense into the boy. But Jonas wasn't there. The townspeople were, though. The same ones who'd laughed when she'd paid full price for what they thought was a man, the same ones who'd watched her with pity, suspicion, or quiet malice. But something had shifted. Mrs. Kinney, the seamstress, crossed the road with a folded blue shawl. "For mercy," she said, awkward as a girl, and walked off before Luella could reply. Then old Mr. Thatch tipped his hat as she passed, mumbling, "Brave woman." Luella didn't know what to make of it. Kindness, after all this time, felt like a trick played too late. But it kept coming. Fresh eggs on the porch, firewood stacked behind the shed. And when she entered the chapel later that day, nervous, holding Mercy close, no one stopped her. The pastor even nodded toward the front pew, where sunlight hit the worn oak just right. And that's when Luella realized it wasn't just Mercy who had been born new. It was her. She had walked into that auction a girl looking to vanish beneath a man's shadow. But she had walked out with something far heavier and far more worthy. A life, a child, a name. She could have left, could have followed Jonas, returned Mercy to the bloodline that made her. But she didn't, because when Mercy opened her eyes each morning, it was Luella she reached for. And when her soft hand clutched at a skirt hem, it was Luella's. She folded the deed, tucked it in the drawer by the bed, and kissed Mercy's curls. "They'll never laugh again," she whispered, and meant it. Not because of vengeance or victory, but because this girl, this weight she'd carried, had become the thing that lifted her. And she would carry her, into storms, into stairs, into the kind of life no one had believed she could build. They called a town meeting the following week, something about charity funds and auction protocols, but everyone knew why they really came. Luella didn't intend to speak. She brought Mercy with her, wrapped in the blue shawl, and sat in the back where she figured no one would notice. But when the room grew quiet, and the pastor asked, "Does anyone wish to say something about what happened last Sunday?" Heads turned to her. She didn't stand right away, just looked down at Mercy, whose tiny hand curled around her pinky like a question. Then, slowly, she rose. Her limp was more visible than ever in the silence, and the wooden floor creaked beneath her weight. She didn't speak with fire or fury, just calm, shaking truth. She told them what it felt like to be mocked by men who'd never known hunger, what it meant to outbid every hand in the room and be ridiculed for it, what it meant to open a sack expecting a man to claim, and instead find a life she hadn't prepared for, but loved anyway. "You thought I was foolish," she said, voice barely above the wind brushing through the window cracks. "You laughed when I named her mine. But you didn't hear her cry in the dark. You didn't watch her eyes follow light like it was a miracle. You didn't see her choose me back." By the time she finished, Mercy had begun to fuss, and Luella rocked her gently, never breaking gaze with the room. One woman sniffled. Someone else coughed too loudly, just to mask the shame. But it was the mayor who stood first, adjusting his vest and clearing his throat. "We've made mistakes," he said plainly, "but the town sees what you've done, Miss Luella, and we won't look away from it again." Applause didn't follow. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, heavier, more honest. Outside, the wind had picked up and scattered dust over the steps. Luella stepped out into it with Mercy warm against her chest, and something else rising in her, a quiet power, not born of pride, but of proof. She hadn't just changed the course of one baby's life. She had made a town stop and listen. She had spoken love without needing to shout. And for the first time in her life, Luella didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Not because she asked to be, but because she'd done the unthinkable. She showed them what motherhood could look like when it wasn't earned by blood, but by choice. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. Would you have stepped up and opened that sack? Knowing it might change everything? Tell us in the comments.